So we're moving on. We've had a lot of talk about Army this morning, haven't we? We're now going to be delighted by our next speaker, Martin, who is Air Force. Come forward. I'll just give a little bit of a brief on Martin. He's continuing our sound category of speakers today, and it's great to have an Air Force component. We don't hear as much about Air Force as we do Army. We won't. So Martin, he joined the Royal Australian Air Force in '79 as an aircraft technician, and he was posted to 2 Squadron. The Aircraft Research and Development Unit, No. 1 Flying Training School and Support Command. In '96, Martin commissioned as an aeronautical engineer and served in the DGTA, Officers Training School, No. 38 Squadron. In 2005, Martin was selected to complete the Chief of Air Force Fellowship at the Air Power Development Centre, where he researched and wrote on the development of air power doctrine and contributed to the RAAF Air Power Manual. During this time, he also completed the Masters of Defence Studies and lectured at training institutions on air power history and doctrine. What was that?
A couple of look at yes, but not really.
Excellent. In 2008, Martin left the Air Force in order to take up a position at the Office of Air Force History, and in September 2013 was appointed as the RAAF historian. So once again, we've got a pretty good pedigree in our words today. Martin retired from Defence in 2025, just last year.
Yep.
And is currently writing an official history on the origins of Australian air power. Ladies and gents, please welcome Martin.
Just bear with me for a moment while I get technology operating as intended. Excellent. So I've got the session before lunch, so no pressure to finish on time. Just want to preface something before and I will be working off notes, so any of my ex-students would soon tell you, don't let Martin freehand it because you will miss lunch and possibly dinner. But I will be making a couple of references to the Martin Elite's government, singing a few of their praises. That praise will be more in the line of the way that they could develop, apply and stick with strategy, not necessarily their system of government or repression or record on human rights. So I just want to make that separation clear now, and it might save a bit of angst later. Okay, good morning. Oh, I'm sorry, for those, any graduates from any form of staff college, there is the compulsory debt Prussian quote. Okay, as the title suggests, this paper examines the employment of air power in the Vietnam War as a case study in the overall failure of Western military power, which is US and Australia's strategic aims in the Vietnam War. The context, though, will be less about the day-to-day air operations and more about the effectiveness as air power as a component of national strategy during conflict. The experience of the Vietnam War is an example of the challenges faced by the practitioners of the Western way of war in complex, adaptive, limited wars, especially insurgencies. Given the Australian perspective of this conference, I'll also touch briefly on the basis for the Australian involvement in the conflict, but will not dwell on the subject. And of course, having been the previous RAAF historian, I currently just put in a couple of words about Air Force as well, I promise not to. Two definitions first need to be understood. The Western way of war refers to the employment of massed military power used with decisive intent, energy and planning. Most importantly, it is military power used as an extension of national policy, a means to achieve strategic aims through deterrence and coercion, thereby forcing the adversary to accept the will of the leader rather than being persuaded through diplomatic entreaty. This approach has both strengths and weaknesses. not the least of which is the near unanswerable question of what keeps the adversary to agreed peace terms once the military forces have left the theatre. Current Australian definition of air power is the total strength of a nation's capacity or capability to conduct and influence activities in, through and from the air to achieve its objectives. While the definition of air power might differ in phrasing across the world's air forces, the common element in most is that air power is a component of national power and the employment in accordance with strategic aims as set by government, and not simply a term referring to the employment of aircraft and operations. That's right. Air power, as opposed to fighting from the air, relies on a combination of the following factors to be strategically effective. Available target sets have to be centres of gravity which are essential to the adversary's national power model or their strategic aims. The effects generated by air power must have direct impact on those adversaries who have influence over national strategic aims. The effects generated through air power have to be sufficient to obtain the desired strategic outcomes. And here's the important one. There must be strategy in place for the sustainment of the effects generated by air power before air power is employed. In other words, when a conflict is drawing to a negotiated settlement, coercive force is no longer an option. If the adversary is aware of this fact, they know they only have to ride out the air campaign before dictating their own terms in any negotiations. What then can be used to maintain the coercive effects previously generated by air power? Good question. And maybe that might be a question being asked in certain places, even as we speak. When the US and the Allies committed military power to the conflict in Vietnam, it did so in the expectation it would be done in the Western way. Overwhelming military force applied to coerce the government, the military forces of North Vietnam and the Viet Cong to align with the strategic objectives of the governments of the US and South Vietnam. When, in April 1975, the victorious forces of North Vietnam took control of Saigon, it was evident that the overwhelming superiority of Western military power of the US had failed to achieve any of its objectives. Why? This paper will explore at least part of that answer, to that question through the lens of air power as an exemplar of all forms of national power employed during the conflict. First, a brief overview of the initial Australian commitment to the Vietnam War. The Australian involvement in the Vietnam conflict was generated by a number of strategic interests. In the post-1945 period, the region to Australia's north became increasingly identified as an area of importance as the influence of European control receded, and the spread of communism increased almost in lockstep with the re-emergence of national identities in the previously colonised states. More specifically, the origins of the Australian involvement in Vietnam can be traced to the 1954 Geneva Conference, called to finalise the armistice agreements which ended the fighting in the Korean War. Also on the conference agenda were discussions around the emerging independent states of Indochina, that Laos, Cambodia and Vietnam. While the Geneva Conference failed to reach a meaningful agreement on the situation in Korea, it did result in a decision on the withdrawal of French forces from Indochina and the partition of Vietnam along the 17th parallel, separated into a communist north and a republican south. Elections were to be held no later than July 1956 to enable the Vietnamese to decide on the nature of their political system of government in a unified Vietnam. Known as the Geneva Accords, the decision concerning Vietnam did not rest easily with at least two of the key actors. Ngo Dinh, the Prime Minister and late President of South Vietnam, did not favour an election on reunification due to what he considered to be an oppressive political environment in North Vietnam that would not result in free and fair ballots. While in Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh, President of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, while outwardly supportive of the elections, maintained support of the Viet Minh movement in South primarily to maintain a political military presence in the larger rural areas and to adversely influence the government of the South. When Ngo Dinh Diem government formally declared that the promised elections would not go ahead, there began a progressive slide of what became an increasingly violent and widespread communist-led insurgency in the South. In a move intended to curb the communist influence developing in South Vietnam as part of the national intent of encouraging democratic stability across the Indochina region, Australia joined with several regional states as well as with Britain, France and the US to form the Southeast Asia Treaty Organisation. The aim of SEATO was to underwrite the sovereign independence of Southeast Asian states. More specifically, the US increasingly directed SEATO activities towards curbing the spread of communism in the region. As the security and political situation in South Asia deteriorated, Australia and the US became increasingly drawn into a war aimed at resisting further North Vietnamese incursions into the south. This was no surprise and had been a policy foreshadowed in Australia for some years. In 1956 strategic basis for Australian Defence Policy document, the language intent was specific, stating in relation to the RAAF states to Australia's north that collective defence is the most effective and economic method for ensuring Australia's security. In partnership with other Southeast Asia Treaty Organisation countries, but principally with the US, Australia began to express concerns regarding the threat posed to Thailand, Cambodia, Laos and Vietnam, or what was referred to other power groups. Further defining the specific threat to Vietnam in a 1955 SEATO report as communist violation of the 54 Geneva Accords, in response to the escalation of Vietnam operations, the Australian government began to look to its defence force for contributions to the stabilisation of the political conditions in South Vietnam. The Air Force contributions started small. Over the period of 9 to 21 May 1963, a C-47 Dakota from No. 2 Squadron's transport flight based at RAAF Base Duckworth, Malaysia, and captained by Flying Officer David Cooper, conducted 28 humanitarian aid sorties in South Vietnam, delivering some 25,000 kilograms of food and medical supplies to multi-yard refugees displaced by the Viet Cong insurgency. This short deployment marked the beginning of the RAAF presence in Vietnam. By 1967, the RAAF had 3 squadrons in Vietnam, consisting of Iroquois helicopters, Caribou transports and Canberra bombers, with numerous other supporting elements. The RAAF presence in Vietnam was to continue in varying forms and with only minor breaks until 1975. I'd just like to close the Australian phase of this presentation with an image of 3 of the last 4 Australians 3 of the last 4 Australian servicemen in Vietnam, literally the last ADF boots on the ground in Vietnam. When Australia withdrew its forces from Vietnam during 71 and 2, it did so in the expectation of successful negotiations between the US and the North Vietnamese. The resulting settlement did not last. In 75, the North separated the South, and the Vietnam we know today was born out of the result. As the North closed in on Saigon, RAAF C-130 aircraft conducted a number of evacuation flights of refugees, orphans and Australian embassy staff. When what was supposed to have been the last C-130 was due to depart, it was found to be overloaded. It required offloading of the freight and the 4-man airfield defence guard security section. Fortunately, a spare C-130 was circling just off the coast as a contingency measure, and here you see the last of the 3 ADGs waiting somewhat pensively to see who arrived at the airfield first. The North Vietnamese or the RAAF C-130. Fortunately, RAAF got in first. I have spoken with one of those gentlemen, and he said that they looked like that in the photo because they wanted to look at least like any sort of military personnel as possible, and they had completely disassembled every weapon they had and dispersed it all over the tarmac. So they were never going to be seen as a threat to the North Vietnamese up north. But now let's move to the big picture of the war, which needs to focus on the American conduct of what would result in the largest bombing campaign by tonnage the world has ever known. One of the great lessons to come out of the war was the need for a unified command and control of air power. Over the course of the Vietnam War, there was in effect 7 independent, self-contained air forces operating as part of the West's forces. These consisted of the US Strategic Air Command. This force was ostensibly part of the US strategic deterrent intended to threaten the USSR. However, it was also employed in operations in and around Vietnam, conducting conventional bombing, air-to-air refuelling, and strategic air reconnaissance operations in Southeast Asia, including over North and South Vietnam. The US 7th Air Force, operating from 10 air bases within Vietnam. The 7th Air Force was under the operational control of the Military Assistance Mission Vietnam, or MHHV, as it was known, and responsible for the tactical missions such as suppression of enemy air defences, electronic countermeasures, combat air patrols, close air support, interdiction, tactical reconnaissance missions within Vietnam, and for the conduct of strike missions against or across the region. The 13th Air Force, operating across the whole of Indochina as well as in Vietnam, the 13th Air Force was intended not only to operate as a part of the Vietnam Air War, but was expected to act as a deterrent force across Asia as part of SEATO. The USMC, operating attack, tactical reconnaissance and strike fighters as well as helicopters in support of US Marine ground operations. The USMC aircraft operated from both carriers at sea and from air bases within Vietnam. The command and control of this air element was closely guarded by the Marines. For example, it took the power of no less than the President of the USA to broker an agreement between the Marines and the USAF on the integration of their respective strike missions during the Battle of Khe Sanh, which included consideration of nuclear weapons, I might venture. And then there's the United States Navy. A carrier force conducted an extensive range of roles, including strategic strike missions into North Vietnam. Additionally, the USN conducted suppression of enemy air defences, ECM, combat air patrols, close air support, interdiction, tactical reconnaissance missions. The flexibility and persistence of the carrier aviation on Yankee Station is often overlooked and at times undervalued contribution to the tactical and operational conduct of the war. Like the Marines, the US Navy closely guarded control of its air assets. Then there was the US Army, operating helicopters and airlift aircraft in support of ground operations. And now we have the South Vietnamese Air Force, operating a mix of fighters, helicopters, airlift aircraft in support of operations in the South Vietnamese forces. Side note, the Australian contribution was embedded within the predominantly the 7th US Air Force. We weren't there operating quite separately. But with all those air elements throughout the war, at no stage was there any single unified command structure over all of these air elements. While MHHV had an air operations cell, which could task elements of the USAF and Army, there was no ultimate control or centralised planning across all 7 discrete air components. This resulted in the replication and inefficient use of capability, delays in response times for immediate tasking, and the constant need for deconfliction of air assets at the tactical level rather than at the operational planning stage. So, if air power at the strategic level is to generate effects in accordance with national strategic aims, how can a coherent, consistent and synergistic air strategy be developed and enacted across the theatre of operations if there was no single air commander or central planning authority responsible to the government, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or to the theatre, land and maritime commanders? What we see in the command and control of air power in the Vietnam War is the breakdown of the symbiotic relationship between national intent and military action. This, though, may not have been as big a problem as it was, for compounding these complex C2 arrangements was an absence of an achievable and consistent strategic intent coming out of the White House. Just after the 1965 start of the initial US bombing offensive into North Vietnam, known as Rolling Thunder, the USAF Chief of Staff, General McConnell, stated that the strategic intent he was working to, and as directed by President Johnson, was air power was to be used as a political tool of strategic persuasion, and that the intent of Rolling Thunder was not to achieve total victory. Rather, it is designed as an instrument of foreign policy for the attainment of a diplomatic objective. This is all well and good on the surface, but let's look at what this strategy more closely. From a North Vietnam perspective, what McConnell was saying was that the US President had directed that the bombing of North Vietnam could only target and destroy what the US thought might hinder the North's war efforts in an attempt to bring on negotiations, but could not seek to destroy the North's instruments of government, war sustainment infrastructure, or its military capability entirely. The strategic planning and control of Rolling Thunder was not managed at theatre level, or even at the higher Pentagon level through the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The identification, selection of the so-called strategic targets, as well as the decisions on the intensity of the bombing, was determined each Tuesday by a White House staff committee chaired by the President for implementation by the in-theatre air forces over the following week. No point was there a USAF officer involved in any of this selection process. From President Johnson's perspective, he was employing a positive strategy to achieve an end while avoiding the negative outcome of escalating to the point that might cause the USSR or China to enter the war, the threat of which hung over the White House throughout the Vietnam War like the spectre of the Grim Reaper. What Johnson was actually doing was preventing the application of air power in its full destructive capacity and capability to coerce the North Vietnamese and impact on their war aims. He was also telegraphing to the North that Rolling Thunder was a survivable campaign if they were to hold on to their fundamental beliefs. At the operational level, the lack of a combined air operations centre made dissemination of Johnson's weekly revised target list difficult to implement, and in the allocation of air assets across the competing priorities of close air support, interdiction, strike and tactical reconnaissance missions. This lesson was well learned as evident in later doctrine, directives and command and control organisation of the coalition air component formed as part of the Gulf War in 1990-91. Both Swarthcroft and the Air Commander, Lieutenant General Chuck Horner, were adamant that the air war would be centrally commanded and directed by a unified air operations centre. One of the other major efforts of Rolling Thunder was to restrict the movement of logistics and manpower support from the north to the forward deployed North Vietnamese regulars and Viet Cong forces operating in South Vietnam. It was considered that without external support, the insurgency in the south would wither and die. There began a long and near continuous series of air operations aimed at cutting supply routes such as the Ho Chi Minh Trail and other key rail and road infrastructure leading from the north into the South Vietnam, including targets in Laos and Cambodia. These operations were an echo of two previous US interdiction campaigns conducted first in World War II and again in Korea, both known as Strangle 1 and Strangle 2, respectively. The World War II operation was aimed at cutting German logistics lines and to destroy supplies moving south down the Italian peninsula during 1944, while Operation Strangle 2 was a similar interdiction operation aimed at cutting North Korean and Chinese supply moving south towards the 38th parallel during the Korean War. In Vietnam, operations such as Strangle Hole were conducted in Vietnam as an enduring interdiction campaign throughout the war. Now, while partly effective, Strangle 1 and Strangle 2 were not 100% successful in their own right as purely air operations. The experience of both World War II and Korea showed that it was necessary for ground forces to sustain a tempo of operations against first the Germans and later North Korean fronts in order to force on the adversary an expenditure of personnel and munitions and fuel to a level beyond what could be sustained. While a similar outcome was intended for the interdiction operations on the Ho Chi Minh Trail in the Vietnam War, this proved to be unachievable. As noted by the USAF's official historian, Dr. Richard Hallian, in his appraisal of the World War II operation in Italy, the reduction in support for fielded forces from air attack is only achievable while the adversary is forced to increase his tempo of operations beyond what the supply routes can provide for. Without the means to constantly force the tempo of operations of the disparate North Vietnamese forces, Viet Cong and similar irregular formations, the reduction of supplies from the north mattered little. As noted by air power historian Dr. Mark Plotfelder, the communist forces operating in South Vietnam, even at the height of their strength of some 300,000 in 1967, required only 34 tonnes of externally provided support per day. Further, the North Vietnamese and the VC
did not have to maintain active operations in the field. They only had to maintain a force in being to achieve the political effects that they required. They were able to decide when and where to conduct low-intensity operations and to always ensure that they operated within their means to continue to generate those political effects. There was also at the heart of Rolling Thunder a weakness that no amount of measured bombing could mitigate. That weakness was the instability and lack of legitimacy of the South Vietnamese government. In May 1963, Diem's pro-Catholic regime was toppled as a result of continued persecution of Buddhists and the widespread dissatisfaction with his handling of the war. This began nearly 2 years of near-continuous political instability in South Vietnam. There followed through 1964 to February 65 no less than 7 regime changes, including 5 coups. By March 65, the government of South Vietnam was barely stable and it would not be until elections of 67 the regime of Nguyen Van Thao had any form of legitimacy, and that was tenuous at best. From the North's perspective, this political instability was an opportunity to further spread the insurgency politically via the National Liberation Front and the Viet Cong forces. US bombing, while hindering the North's operations, could not influence the North's propaganda-led strategy, so long as the government of South Vietnam continued to appear vulnerable and lacking legitimacy. From 1965 until the fall of the South Vietnamese government in 1975, the Communists were able to maintain a narrative which attacked any initiative of the South Vietnamese government while also portraying the administration as a corrupt puppet of the imperial colonial American regime. Without strong government in the South and political leadership which could harness national will, the limited military power exercised through Rolling Thunder was insufficient to shape the North's resolve and the long-term vision for a united Vietnam. The inability for the US to shape the North's political will was not limited by air power alone. As the prospect of Rolling Thunder generating meaningful results was receding, the US began a troop surge to peak at just under 550,000 in 1969. However, neither ground or air power could address that fundamental weakness of South Vietnam, that the government and the political system was not sufficient to unify the nation and to generate an indigenous military able to sustain a war effort that would threaten the North. The widespread US air and ground offensives conducted within South Vietnam did little to reassure many in the South that their government and the US were not at war with them, rather than with the Communist North. Given the strategic circumstances that seemed to favour the North, what changed in the war which caused the North to agree to the Paris Peace Accords in January 1973, which effectively ended the war for the US? The answer to this question can be found in the events post-Tet Offensive in 1968 and the change in political relationship between the 1969 Nixon administration on one hand and the USSR and China on the other. After the strategic surprise of the North's Tet Offensive in early '68, the domestic debate within the US about the ongoing war shifted towards an increasing anti-war narrative. In '69, the newly installed Nixon administration announced the Vietnamization of the offensive operations and the withdrawal of US ground forces. This policy essentially meant that the responsibility for offensive ground operations would become the responsibility of South Vietnam's armed forces. As the drawdown of US forces continued in the early 70s, the perceived vulnerability of the South Vietnamese forces encouraged North Vietnam to launch its own Easter Offensive of 1972. While this offensive was defeated through the combined efforts of overwhelming US air power and the South Vietnamese ground forces, the North Vietnamese were able to retain a secure foothold in South Vietnam. The results of the Easter Offensive was in fact a two-edged sword for the North. While holding ground in the South, they held considerable bargaining table power at any peace negotiations. However, this offensive posture became at the expense of reverting to traditional military operations, which not only presented US air power with viable targets, but also became reliant on a logistics system also extremely vulnerable to airstrikes.
Concurrent with the events in Vietnam was the successful policy of détente between the US, the USSR and China. These discussions resulted in Nixon deciding that he could escalate the bombing in North Vietnam and its conventional military forces in the south without the intervention of the USSR or China, providing he remained committed to a US withdrawal and the continued acknowledgement of the North Vietnam government. Absent, though, was any commitment to meaningful unification on democratic lines. Nixon directed that the air offensive, which became known as Linebacker and later Linebacker 2, should target the NBA forces and their now essential logistics systems and transport infrastructure. Further, the previously off-limits targets in and around Hanoi, as well as the harbour and local facilities around Hap Yong, were to be specifically targeted and either mined or destroyed. The success of Linebacker operations, greatly enhanced by the successful employment of precision-guided munitions for the first time, the effects generated by the Linebacker operations over May to October 72 were to successfully progress peace talks in Paris with representatives from North Vietnam. When these talks stalled in November, a renewed and significantly escalated offensive, Linebacker 2, was launched in December. The results of Linebacker 2 were significant. The North Vietnamese forces in South Vietnam were becoming increasingly isolated and vulnerable to both air and ground offensive. Additionally, the North's harbours were closed to shipping due to aerial mining, and the ports and associated infrastructures were destroyed by bombing. This was an important development in US targeting. The North was wholly reliant on the importation of all its heavy weaponry and munitions, as well as for aircraft and surface-to-air missiles. In the face of continuing airstrikes and the risk of a renewed ground war, the North was forced to resume peace talks in Paris. While the peace agreement may have been hastened by the bombing offensive, the fundamental political aim of North Vietnam, that of the reunification of Vietnam under a communist government, had not changed. By March 75, the US had legislated against the return to airstrikes in support of South Vietnam. The result was that there was no form of coercion through the threat of air power. Furthermore, South Vietnam was at its weakest state since 1963. US financial aid was being cut by 20% each year, resulting in an ever-diminishing domestic military capability in South Vietnam. In March 1975, a renewed and confident North Vietnam launched a well-orchestrated ground offensive into the south. By May 75, combat operations had largely been completed. The government and military forces of the south had ceased to exist, and the long-term aims of North Vietnam had been realised. In a 1977 interview with Der Spiegel, in relation to the defeat of South Vietnam by the North, Kissinger remarked, "It was a very painful occasion, and we did it to ourselves by reducing aid to Vietnam in each peacetime year by 25%. This statement reflects the extent of how the West truly misunderstood the motivating factors behind North Vietnam's fight for reunification as a communist nation. Kissinger only saw failure from the perspective of the strategy the US failed to execute effectively in pursuit of its strategic war aims, while completely ignoring the fact that the North won through its own positive strategies at the heart of its campaign for self-determination. The commitment of the North Vietnamese government to achieving their national aims of a united Vietnam were both long-standing and held very dear. In the North's eyes, the US actions were another test to their resolve. In a June 1969 speech, the North Vietnam's General Vo Nguyen Giap stated, "The Vietnamese people have never bowed to any invader who in less than 3 decades defeated Japanese fascism and French imperialism one after the other, and now we are staunchly fighting and keeping in check the US imperialist aggressors." From the North's point of view, the conflict was less about the spread of communism or even the destabilisation of South Vietnam, but more about the unification of the nation and the freedom from colonial powers or similar external interests. The American and by extension Australian forces were intent on maintaining a division of Vietnam and the suppression of its rights for self-determination. One of the most significant differences of the North Vietnamese and US strategies was the profoundly different context each strategy was executed. Where the US strategy was one of coercion to force political change, The North Vietnamese strategy was one of denial of the military effectiveness of the US and South Vietnamese forces. Just consider the difference between these strategies for a moment. The US was targeting political objectives, nationalism, ideology through Western military target sets which did not have physical vulnerabilities as such. In fact, the more the North was attacked with kinetic means, the more the US reinforced the idea that they were an imperial aggressor and a pseudo-colonial power. Whereas the North Vietnamese strategy in targeting US forces was effective because of the vulnerability of the US government policy to public opinion. Without the foundation of a specific threat to the US security or prosperity, the national will of the US was influenced more by the personal and financial cost of the war rather than a desire to win sustained by some form of national will or ideology. By simply resisting US aggression and generating casualties, the North's kinetic effects had a direct influence on their strategic objectives. In the arms of the world's greatest superpower, the viable long-term nationalistic strategy of the North prevailed over the myopic strategy of the West. In considering the war in Vietnam, and the air war in particular, there develops, I think, 4 salient points for enduring problems to Western governments and to defence forces, especially in the relation to the exercise of air power. First, there are conflicts which cannot be resolved through the application of military force alone. When the adversary motivation is driven by fundamental ideology, be it religious, political or cultural, military power will not be sufficient of itself to coerce the adversary, to permanently bend to outside will to ensure a lasting conclusion to conflict. And we've seen this repeatedly. Second, tactical and even operational success is not a guarantee of strategic success if the effects being generated do not contribute to the achievable national strategic goals. For example, control of the air is not a guarantee of success where the freedom of operations engendered by that air control is not or cannot be used to strategic effect. Third, there is no independent air campaign in the same sense there is no independent maritime or land campaign. In an era of increasing connectivity through political, media, space, electromagnetic and cyber domains, the concept of a separate sea, land and air campaigns is an anachronism. And fourth, and closely aligned with the above points, is that command and control of air power must be unified and seamless across the strategic, operational and tactical levels of conflict. Thank you.
Is there questions or? Okay. We do have time for 2 questions before lunch. Oh, there are no questions, thank you. Does anyone have any questions? Yes. 1, 2.
I think the first part of your speech mentioned that after 1955, according to the Geneva Accord, the election should be organized for Vietnam. And after that, no election. So the North Vietnam accused the Republic of Vietnam not to cooperate to organize the election. But the point the South Vietnam raises, I did not sign up in that agreement. We did not sign in that agreement.
We did not sign that agreement, and that was one of the issues.
So which one that's confused?
Yeah, you know, from an outside looking in, for me, it was the conduct of North Vietnam in the insurgency and the destabilisation efforts to prevent free and fair elections occurring. I think they were happy to have elections, but they were never going to be free and fair, especially in the North, and they were going to destabilise any efforts for elections in the South. When the South Vietnamese government withdrew from those elections, which they hadn't signed up for, I think they were notably absent from the Geneva Convention, so the Geneva Accords, I should say. What we're seeing there is, in some ways, almost like a wedge strategy from the North, forcing the South into making a decision that they can then herald as the South breaking the Accords rather than the other way
Hey, Martin, just a bit, I was going to go back to your air power, particularly to your air power point you're making in counter-revolutionary warfare. We're seeing a massive close air support and air power being delivered in Gaza and Lebanon and what have you. Do you think there's any lessons with that, with the sort of thing you were talking about, the use of air power in Yemen?
Yeah, I think there's quite a strong connection. And I'll use a bit of a phrase here, you know, if you're not using it wisely to generate the effects that are important, you might win the war but you'll lose the peace. And when I look at places like Gaza, I'm going to step into this minefield very, very carefully and with some reluctance. When you look at places like Gaza and Lebanon, and even to a degree Iran at the moment, all they're really achieving is the recruiting for the next generation of opposition to either Israel or US or similar countries' strategies for the region.
In fact, just as a throwaway, as a comment, I read somewhere where they said that in counter-revolutionary warfare, the best weapon to use is a bayonet, because we don't affect anyone else's.
I would actually, up to a point, I would agree. And two things spring to mind around that statement. I think now and in the future, the best weapon in a counter-revolutionary will be a drone that will land on someone's forehead. It implies several things. Nowhere is safe, and we're always watching. But the other thing is, I think the best tool in any counterinsurgency is an effective counterinsurgency that looks at the cognitive domain rather than operating in the kinetic domain.
One for Dr. Richardson. Is he here?
Yeah, sorry. I'm lurking up the back.
Good man. Can you hear me?
I absolutely can.
The General Officer commanding Malaya at the time of the emergency was General Sir Ragnar Garrett, and he was the originator, really, proponent of the Pentropic Division. Now, presumably, he must, together with his cronies, have thought it a very good choice, the architecture of that division. How do you reconcile that choice with its failure?
I think, as I said, I think Garrett, yeah, it's really interesting. He's thinking really hard about what the future war that the army will encounter will look like, and it's a really interesting document he writes where he makes the point that if we've said we're going to use nuclear weapons at a certain threshold of violence, why would the enemy ever exceed that threshold? In which case, our assumptions that we need a Pentropic Division, for example, we need something that can fight on an attacking nuclear battlefield are misplaced, and actually we need a much larger army that can fight the kind of sustained campaign that they eventually see in Vietnam. I think it's just that they feel they have to try something, and that some of the things that Pentropic promised, like the idea that it would generate so much more combat power from the same number of men, it would maximise firepower in a unit or a formation. I think they were just very seductive things for the army, and they thought it was worth trying. And then, when it proved unwieldy in the field and ineffective in the field, then, obviously Wilton did away with it. But the other thing, obviously, I didn't mention is that also they had to reorganise every time the battalion went to Malaya for strategic reserve duty. They didn't deploy battle groups. They deployed a British Commonwealth Tropical Warfare Infantry Battalion. So that was a huge administrative burden on the army. So, yeah, I think, Garrett had good intentions, and I think there's a lot of validity in trying. It just proved not to work in practice.
I think it's interesting we were talking about the vision, it's all new for me, about considering the nuclear option. I mean, in the 1950s, when we decided to buy the Canberra jet bomber, Air Force knew it was going to be replacing 240 plus bombers, four-engine Lincoln bombers with 48 jets, which was never going to be able to drop the same weight of bombs. So they bought those aircraft in anticipation that could be armed with nuclear weapons. And the Air Force went through a cycle of discussions with both the US and the UK about what would be a suitable weapon to put onto the Canberra. The only one that was available was a weapon that the the RAAF said they could supply us if the American said it was okay. But then the Menzies government stepped in about 56, I think it was, and said, no nuclear options, what are you doing? And then within 2 years, the Air Force adopted the RAF's air power doctrine, and the very first page, the first paragraph on the first page says, we are a nuclear strike force. And the Chief of Air Force, not long after his tenure as the Chief of Air Staff, I should say, had his tenure cut short by 1 year, replaced by somebody else by Menzies. So he kept saying, no nuclear option.
Martin, that was fascinating. The strategic, the operational attack with failure, essentially of air, I think was brought out by your reference to Operation Rolling Thunder. I'm not sure, I didn't know much about Operation Rolling Thunder. Obviously knew they bombed North Vietnam, but clearly from your perspective, that was one of the key elements where it started to fall down. Yeah, for sure. The other thing that I did note, on one of your slides you had, there was a RAAF contingent in Ubon in Thailand.
Yes, absolutely.
Did we have many RAAFs there?
Yes, we had we were rotating a slightly understrength squadron, it was 79 squadron. They were supported by a base squadron and a few other auxiliary elements. And they were supported out of RAAF base Duckworth, where we had the SAFE squadrons at the time. But as a non-SEACO member who didn't trust the US anyway, Malaysia said, you're here as part of the Commonwealth Reserve, you're not here as part of SEACO, you can't support Ubon from here. So when they wanted to turn an aircraft over, that sort of stuff, the airplanes would come out of Ubon and for a bit of flying around off the coast, and a couple of aircraft would fly out from Duckworth and off the coast, and maybe they landed in different places later. Just to confuse the issue.
And one last point just before we do break for lunch, because I see the party pies and sausage.
It's going cold, mate, come on.
I won't let it get cold. Continuing the rivalry between Army and Air Force, I did happen to note that the image you had up there, the last 3 RAAFs coming out of Vietnam, they looked extremely relaxed. Which is quite normal, really, for RAAFs, isn't it?
Well, the Army said anyone can do a part, but thank you.